So welcome everybody. Hello, and we're so glad you could join us for today's presentation featuring Dr. Ken Dykewald. I'm Remus Jason. I'm the Executive Director of PSS, a multi-service nonprofit here in New York City. And one of our programs is Coming of Age. The mission of Coming of Age is to inspire people 50 and over to live with passion and purpose. And as a result, Coming of Age has been a very active member of the Encore Network. So for you, those of you who are not familiar with the Encore Network, it's a coalition of leaders who champion the contributions of people 50 plus by creating community, stimulating learning, and inspiring action to transform the Encore stage of life. The Encore Network has over 160 members and 30 member organizations. And for the last 2 years, it's been operating independently under the fiscal sponsorship of the Colorado Nonprofit Development Center. If you're not a member yet, or if you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to visit the website. We'll be putting that into the chat, as well as sharing the URL at the end of the presentation. There, you're going to be able to find events similar to this, as well as access various resources or even connect with others. For today's presentation, I want you to note that we will be sharing the slide deck after the event, and we are recording the session for your later viewing. Also, we encourage you to ask questions. Use the chat to submit your questions. Doug Dixon and I will be monitoring the chat to share with Dr. Dykewald to see how many he can answer before the end of the session. What I love about the Encore Network is the opportunity to work with wonderful professionals and leading experts from all over the world. And that's why I'm thrilled to have the honor and privilege to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Ken Dykewald. Dr. Dykewald's seminal book, Age Wave, it literally sits on the bookshelf of every professional in the field of aging. Since its publication in the late 80s, Dr. Dykewald has emerged as the visionary thought leader on the implications of the age wave on our society. Ken is a psychologist, a gerontologist, and best-selling author of 18 books. He's the founder and CEO of Age Wave, a think tank and consultancy focused on the implications of global aging and increasing longevity. His client list includes over half of the Fortune 500. He has served as a fellow of the World Economic Forum, and he's been a featured speaker at many of the annual ASA conferences, as well as 2 White House conferences on aging. And I had the pleasure of being on an advisory board meeting for the RSVP here in New York City, and one of our advisory board members, Anita, mentioned that when she was in corporate America in the late 80s, she recalls hearing about Ken Dykewald and his book, Age Wave. And the way she puts it is he brought gerontology into the mainstream. So with that, I'd like to invite Ken to see what he's going to offer up today to bring into the mainstream. So Ken, I'll leave it up to you now.
Well, hi, everybody. Let me say hi from Bay Area, California. It's nice to see lots of smiling faces, including my brother, Alan, on the session this morning. So I've got a lot to cover, and I'm going to ask for my slides to be brought up. And I'll ask my brother, Alan, can you see that? It says giving in retirement. Just wave your hand if you can.
We see.
All right, good. So what I'm going to ask you guys to do, since I know you've already, all of you have got a kind of a deep investment and commitment to Encore and related themes and programs, I'm going to ask you to take the way you currently think about this and allow me to maybe share my view of it all. And it may be exactly the same as yours, or I might see things a little differently. And who knows, maybe we can all learn something from all that. First, I want to start with the idea of that having worked in the so-called field of aging now for 48 years, one of the problems is that people who work in the field are inclined to think of older people as needing their help. That's kind of stuck in their head. It's an existential framework. It began in the 1930s when the poverty level among older people was over 30%. When people were disenfranchised, sent to the sidelines, didn't have much of a purpose or a role. And so we got this notion that old people, they're poor, they're sick, they're frail, they're needy. And so when we say older adults or a growth in the number of older people, for many people, that means, boy, more and more people who are going to need our help. On the other hand, and by the way, that's true. There's definitely truth, although the poverty level among people over 65 is now about 10%, which is half the poverty level of young people in this country. So older people are doing far better than young people with regard to their percentages in poverty and such. But then there's this other idea. When we see the massive growth right now around the world, there's about 1 billion people over the age of 60. Do we think of those as people who need help or prepared to help? And the answer, of course, is both. But I'll tell you a quick story from before COVID. Right before COVID, I was speaking at a conference, and the other speaker was Harrison Ford, the actor. And I never met Harrison Ford before. He was a compelling speaker. He's a climate activist, and he made a big dramatic set of statements about how we need to get all the young people in the world planting trees and save the planet. And he got a standing ovation. And I had a private meeting with him afterward. You know, I fawned over him a little bit, blah, blah, blah. Love your movies, Raised at a Lost Ark, and so on. And then I said to him, hey, let me ask you a question. There's 1 billion people around the world over the age of 60, and nobody has tasked them with anything. Why don't you get them planting some trees? Save the planet. And Harrison looked at me and he says, you know, Ken, I'd never thought of that. And by the way, that is partly the problem. You know, when Greta Thunberg gave her speech at the UN and talked about how we grown-ups have kind of turned the planet into a junkyard, most older people didn't say, oh, yeah, we did. Now we got to clean it up. They said, who's that crazy young gal? And maybe they liked her, maybe they didn't. But I'd like to at least suggest, and I'm going to be very opinionated in this session. I'm not getting paid. Nobody's sponsoring me. I get to wear my Dad's Against Guns t-shirt, and I get to put out some of my personal views, which I've been thinking about a lot more lately. We got clearly both going on here. And it's some of the same people who need help and who want to help. So let me talk a little bit about giving to get us started. It turns out we are a very giving and generous nation. It's hard to remember that because if you turn on the media, and as most of you know, the media are no longer so many professional journalists. They're mostly entertainers. And the more crazy things they say, the more likely you're going to watch their show some more. And the more they make it seem like we all hate each other, the more people seem to like their network or their website or their online position. But as it turns out, we're a very generous country. And I'd like to at least widen the theme of giving so that it's money, it's minutes, and it's meaning. It's not just one, it's all three. And I am going to get to, before my presentation is over, what I think the future could be and what role we can play in bringing that about. First, if you look at charitable giving, it turns out that it's tripled over the last 40 years. And so we are becoming increasingly a giving people. That's a good thing. You know, it's something I think we could even be more proud of than we pay much attention to. If you want to know who does the giving, people say, oh, that must be the big corporations. Oh, no, it's all the foundations. Actually not. It's families and individuals are responsible for almost 78 cents on every dollar that's given in this country. So when it comes to giving money, our corporations give some, foundations give some, but often to young people causes. But overall, it's families and individuals. Then people will often think, well, it's the super rich people that do all the giving. And what this chart lays out is as a percentage of people's income, who are the biggest givers? And it turns out it's the people with the very modest levels of resources and the people with the very high level of resources that give the most. Now, stay with me. I'm going to build the plot here, Rob. if you look at giving of dollars by generation, there's probably not a big surprise here. The older members of our population have the greatest amount of dollars. They've got the greatest potential for giving back, and they do give more as a percentage than younger generations. Another piece of the giving has to do with volunteerism. There are countries in this world that don't even have volunteerism. We have an active volunteer sector of our society, and there's quite a large number of hours that are given. So we've done surveys where we, AgeWave, my company, we've asked people, so why do you give? And snarky people say, oh, people give because they get tax breaks. And yeah, that's something people take into account. I do, my wife and I do. But the number one reason it just soars above the others is people give because they feel like it makes a difference in the lives of others. Now that might be because people go to church or synagogue or to their mosque, or it might be that they were raised to be caring. A few years ago, there was a gentleman who was believed to be the leading religious scholar in the world, Houston Smith. He had been the head of the religious studies department at MIT. He wrote the book Religions of Man. He's advisor to the Dalai Lama. He's a practicing Christian and Hindu. And he was in his 90s. And I was asked if I would do his last interview. Not because I'm an expert on religions, but because I was going to interview him about aging, death, and beyond. By the way, portions of that interview can be found on YouTube. So that's Houston, Huston Smith. And it was maybe the most interesting 2-hour discussion I've ever had in all of my years being in this field. But at one point I said to him, you've lived so much longer than many of your mentors and your teachers and your guides. And you've been very best friends with Aldous Huxley, who died in his 60s. And I said to him, Houston, is there anything extra you've learned in all of your 90 plus years of life? And he thought about my question for a minute. And he says, yeah, there's a teaching for all of us. Be a little kinder, he said. So it looks like kindness and generosity is a core part of our country, that we want to give and we want to help other people. But let's keep building on that plot line. Now, turns out that this stage of life we call retirement, which I'm going to dwell on just for a minute. By and large, retirement didn't really exist until the 20th century. People worked throughout their years. If grandpa was no longer able to work in the fields, he might mend the fences or help in the house. We were an agrarian-based world, and so it was a different concept of work, but it was generally believed that there were 3 reasons that people worked. One was to earn a livelihood, to keep the money coming in. Second was to have a sense of purpose each day, a reason to get up in the morning. And then third, it was to come in contact with other people. The work was a socializing force. If I worked beside you, you might ask me about my family. I'd ask you about yours. We'd look after each other a little bit, and we'd get to be friends. But in the mid-1930s, our leadership and many other developed nations, there was an interesting challenge. As I mentioned, about a third of the elderly were impoverished, and that was a problem. But there was a 25% unemployment level. So the decision was made that let's formalize, we'll call it retirement, and we'll move the old people out of the workforce. We'll give them a small stipend, $120 a year. And that'll also clear room for the young people to get jobs so that they can get underway with forming their families and kind of making America great, let's say, at that particular time. That generation, the silent generation and the so-called greatest generation, kind of hunkered down and tried to turn this country into a formidable world power. But we didn't really dream up a purpose for retirement other than now you're done. If you go to Webster's Unabridged Dictionary and look up the word retirement, and I'm not making this up, it says to disappear. So this is kind of a work in process. We defined retirement as a time to kind of be done working. You'll get a small stipend. It's gone from $120 a year to, on average, $18,000 a year. It's gone from less than 1% of our federal budget to 23% of our federal budget. Social Security has. And but we haven't really given much thought to what is the purpose of all of our older people. Should they be simply celebrated and said, wow, you worked hard for a lot of decades and now you should just relax, enjoy yourself. Well, that's one approach. Another approach might be to say, wow, we've got this enormous pool of men and women with the greatest concentration of talent, intelligence, emotional intelligence, and resources in the history of the world. Maybe we ought to see if we can get a little help from them. Here's an example of a program that I think is kind of a sweet program. It was a teaching English program in Brazil that got the idea that maybe they could harness some retirees in a retirement community in Chicago. So I'm going to run this clip now. Hopefully the sound will come through clearly.
Hello.
Hello, hello.
Melissa.
Hi, Dick. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
It's the first time that I'm talking with someone from another country.
I'm very excited to be doing this.
I look like I'm only 25, but I'm 88.
I'm live with my old brother. He has 23 years.
Do you know, instead of saying he has 23 years, you could say he is 23 years old.
I tried to go to Lollapalooza that we have next week, I think, in Brazil, but my mom didn't let me.
You got a good mom.
Good morning, dear Julia. Good morning to you.
This is your dad?
That's me and my wife. When we were young.
Oh, you were good looking when you were young. And you're still good looking.
If you could just dream and have whatever you want, what do you think you would like to be doing?
I see myself in a big family, with a beautiful wife. I want to thank you for this change of experience, You are incredible.
Obrigado.
You are my new granddaughter, and I love you.
I love you too.
And if you were here, I would give you a big hug.
Oh yeah, let's hug. Oh. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, that's a sweet, sweet use of technology. Let me keep building on this giving theme. Giving's a funny word. It sort of implies I have something and then I discharge it to you and then I don't have it anymore. So giving is about letting go of something. But we've done some research on this. And for example, we've asked older adults, are you happy? Are you healthy? Do you have a sense of purpose? And people who do not give or volunteer, have decent numbers in terms of happiness, sense of purpose, and health. But if you look at those who do give and volunteer, it's just off the charts. I mean, it's, we think about, take this medicine, you'll feel better. Well, give a little bit more, maybe you'll feel better. And so it not only helps the person who's benefiting, but the giver benefits as well in terms of their well-being, the feeling they've got a sense of purpose, which many older adults struggle with not having one. And also it seems to improve people's health and well-being. Now, then there's this other issue. We follow the media, we follow the ads. It seems that the argument is that older people, they want to be youthful. That's the pitch. I'd like to suggest that people more want to be useful. And that becomes a new dance, because how do we build a world? How do we build a society where we are not only glamorizing and idolizing young people, and the dark side of that is we tend to think less well, we all know about ageism, that we think less well of older people. We think they're less valuable, less attractive, less important. But by the way, they're also less contributory. And maybe that's everyone's responsibility, because we don't make it easy for older people to contribute, nor have we insisted that it be a part of their lives. We basically, as I said, we've not tasked retirees with much of anything. So our studies have shown that 93%, this is last year, of retirees say it's important to feel useful in retirement. And not only that, but when they're feeling useful and they're being contributory, they feel younger, they feel better. It's a positive win all around. Well, let me back this up just for a second. I'm going to show you a clip that's in an individual family. This was created by Gillette. It actually won the Cannes Film Festival award a couple of years ago, and it's giving within a family. Let me see if I can make this work.
Good morning, sir. Ready to get up? Let me get your feet up. How you doing today? Okay. Good morning. I remember always looking at my dad's arms, like when I was like 8, 9, 10 years old. He had arms like Popeye. He was a tugboat captain, and I so admired his physique. And now it's a different story, you know? And that's just the way it is. So my dad had a stroke, and now he can't get around, he can't walk. And he needs me to help him out. And my son Luke and I have been doing it. And I'd do anything for him. I can give you a really good mohawk. You look like a punk rocker. There's a definite role reversal that happens. I have to wake him up in the morning and take care of him and groom him and shave him and shower him. It's actually an honor to do that for your father, because he did it for me when I was a kid. You know, it takes me like a half an hour to shave my father because I have to be so careful.
Can't live without it either.
Okay, I will. Oh, there we go. Okay, good. Love that face. Hi. I'm one of the lucky ones. A lot of my friends my age did not have their dads, and I still have my dad. He always says to me, he looks up at me after I pour love on him for the whole day, and he says, "I don't know what I did to deserve you." And I say, "Dad, I got you. I got you, Dad."
Yeah, let me say something about that before I show my next slide. Cultures have decisions about their master narrative, you know, what's important, what's not important, who's important, who do we find attractive, who do we want to be like, who are our role models. For example, I got into the aging field when I was 24. I'm now a 72-year-old man. I look around and I don't see a lot of really wonderful male role models. You know, for example, you see this T-shirt I'm wearing. It says "Dads Against Guns." I just felt enough is enough with the slaughtering of children. But partly, and I thought I'm going to wear this T-shirt around here and there. And by the way, if anybody wants one, send me an email and I'll send it to you for free. There are people now wearing them all over the country. And a lot of people have come up to me. They said, you know, it's interesting. Moms do a lot. Moms against drunk drivers. Moms battle for this. Moms battle for that. Where are the guys? You know, where are the men? I also feel that we haven't yet created heroic figures around caregiving. We often think that the heroes, if you look at who's on the magazine covers, many of these folks are friends of mine. It's the billionaires. It's the tech wizards, it's the kind of political scoundrels, it's the what we don't celebrate the caregivers, you know. We think, oh, that's an inconvenience, that's a distraction to caregive a mom or a dad or a brother or sister, husband or wife. But I'll tell you what, the caregivers, and right now there's over 40 million caregivers, elder caregivers in this country, and we don't celebrate them, we don't honor them. And many of them, we've done studies of this, say that it was the most, in many ways, the most honorable experience of their life. And they're thankful for having had the opportunity to give in that way, often to somebody who had given to them. Now let's turn the corner and talk about what kinds of changes might be possible. We did a survey in the last few years about what's up with retirees. Why don't you give more? And the response we got was not that it wasn't a priority, but they're not sure who to trust. You know, there's been a lot in the media about this organization takes a lot of money for their executives. You know, this organization is unresponsible, or this organization, or, you know, for example, I'm friends who use the Kaiser healthcare system, which I think is a wonderful healthcare system, but that not-for-profit pays their CEO $20 million a year. And I think, that's a lot of money for a not-for-profit CEO to make. People worry about trustworthiness. They're also concerned there are so many options. I mean, how do I even find my way to an organization that aligns with me? And they may worry that they don't have the money, especially the markets have, you know, really turned funky this year. I just don't have enough money to give, people think. But let me nail this down. 77% of today's retirees say that there's just too many charities to choose from. Frankly, even in the Encore zone, do I give my money to AIM? Do I give my money to RSVP? Do I give my money to Experience Corps? Do I give my money to Eldera? I mean, there's just so many that I think those of us in this field, I think we kind of love the, oh, it's almost like a philanthropreneurialism. We like the idea of doing startups and creating our own organizations and having federations of lots of individual organizations, but doesn't necessarily make it easy for people to know who they should give their money to and who they can count on. You know, there's hundreds of thousands of not-for-profits. And so if you were a retiree and you had $50 or $50,000, you might get confused and not know who to trust and not know where to turn. And then it becomes sort of a competition among these organizations for how do they kind of win your attention. So we looked a little bit in terms of what are some of the differences that boomers are thinking about and hoping for in terms of giving versus their parents' generation. And here's a few slides. Boomers are generally less trusting of organizations. You know, we were a little bit more countercultural when we were coming up through the Vietnam era, a little more questioning of the medical system, a little more questioning of corporations, a little more questioning of, and we're also questioning of charitable organizations. Our parents are more likely to be obedient, more likely to be trusting of existing infrastructures. Boomers are less trusting. What else? This is a big one, folks. Our parents' generation seem to feel comfortable giving money to the Red Cross or the United Jewish Appeal in my family, or some organization that had a big existence. Boomers want to have an impact. They want to know that if they give money or time, it's going to have an impact, and they want to know what the impact is. They want to measure it. You know, enough of them have been involved in purchasing stocks or in working in the for-profit sector that they understand there are metrics, there's measurements of how effective that contribution was. And before they give more, they want to know that their money, what was the impact? How did it work? Whose lives were touched? How much of that money went to administration or went to actually serving people? Also, this is really interesting. I think that the volunteering world itself is caught in the 20th century. And I realize I may be being excessively obnoxious today, and I apologize offending anyone's sensibilities, but I know that the volunteer world a few decades ago largely had to do with the kind of work that teenagers could do, you know, candy stripers at hospitals or serving food at the food bank. Totally valuable activities, but don't really require a lifetime of experience or capability. What boomers are saying is, you know what? I've been a marketer all my life. If I volunteer, I don't want to hand out books at the hospital. I want to teach young people how to be effective marketers. And I've been a doctor all my life. How do I help people with my medical skills? Or I've been a school teacher and I know a lot about children, or I know a lot about teaching. If I volunteer, I want to use my skills and experience in my volunteering. I don't want to just show up and be a warm body. This is extremely relevant to the work you guys do. And as I'll show you in a few minutes, to what I think is going to be where the explosive growth is. One of the great examples, and you could all give wonderful examples, but, you know, frankly, Senior Corps of Retired Executives is a great example. Doctors Without Borders is a great example. I mean, who dreamed that up? Instead of taking this cadre of doctors and having them do menial tasks, why not have them be doctors? You know, maybe it's only a few days a week or a few weeks a year, but especially sending them off to parts of the world that are underserved and where the benefits would be enormously appreciated. So in my view, I think the future of giving is going to be more focused, less spread out all over the place, far more impact oriented. And the reporting has got to be impact oriented and far more hands-on. That is it just about writing checks? I don't know. I'll just give my own personal experience. Writing checks to me, and my wife and I write a lot of checks, doesn't nearly feel as gratifying or nourishing as helping. You know, for example, me preparing this session today, I'm not getting paid. This is pro bono work. This is volunteering for me. Almost half the work I now do, I don't ask to get paid for. You know, my book that just got published last week, The Sages of Aging, all the earnings from that book, and I did that with Elise Pellman, are being donated to the American Society on Aging. My book before that, which took 10 years, What Retirees Want, all my earnings from that are being donated to the American Society on Aging. My memoir that came out last year, Radical Curiosity, which I loved writing, but all my earnings from that are being donated to Esalen Institute. So when I get called by young entrepreneurs or by governments or by for-profit or not-for-profit groups, and there's no funding involved, I think about my portfolio of contribution and work. You know, part of it involves earning money so I can pay my staff and put some money in the bank. But increasingly, as I age, I want more and more of my work to be pro bono, to be for free, which means I'm volunteering. And I really want it to have an impact. You know, people reach out to me regularly and I look at what they're doing and I think they haven't thought it through. The marketing is ineffective. They don't have the funding that they're going to need to really launch this or have a big impact. So I'm looking for impact. Now, this last section, I hope you find this mind stretching a little bit, or maybe you've already thought about these kinds of things. Here's a tragedy. For the last 10 years, the average American retiree, and we've got about 70 million such people, the average American retiree watched 47 hours of television per week. So people ask me, how do I feel about the retired population? And generally, I think they're an underutilized resource and they waste their lives. I don't think the entire purpose of human evolution was to create long-lived men and women so they could sit around and watch television all day long. Gets worse. Only 1/4 of today's retirees volunteer. 3/4 don't volunteer at all. Is something wrong with that? Yeah, there's a lot wrong with that. First of all, we miss out on all of their skills and experience and emotional intelligence. And then people say, oh yeah, we need the older people to help babysit the grandchildren. Well, maybe they don't want to babysit the grandchildren. Maybe they want to help in a school. Maybe they want to guide the creating of a master plan to change the world. Maybe they want to teach. Have we, I had a discussion with Jack Rowe about this. Jack set up the first geriatric medicine department at Harvard when he was 32. He's now 77. And Jack said the highest correlating variable to whether people volunteer in retirement is whether they volunteered when they were working. So we have not systematized giving back as a nation. And so when people enter their retirement, they just don't quite have the habit of doing it. And they don't know where to do it. And they're not quite sure if it's going to be trustworthy or that they'll be treated with respect. And keep in mind too, that many retirees have different reasons for volunteering. It might be to make new friends or to get over grief that they're feeling from the loss of a loved one, or transition from having left their job and now they're trying to figure out who they are. So there are different purposes to be met when securing the contribution of retirees. So this bothers me, and I want it to bother you too. Last week, the average retiree spent, this is the average, 2,820 minutes watching television and 108 minutes volunteering. Now, I'm not suggesting that when people finish their working years, that they sign up for a 40 or 50 hour a week volunteer stint, but to not volunteer at all? That doesn't feel right to me. So we did a survey this past year in partnership with the Edward Jones organization, and we got an extraordinary response that today, 89% of retirees feel that there should be more ways for them to use their talents and knowledge for the benefit of their communities and society at large. By the way, there's not a lot of things you can get 89% of Americans to agree on. This was amazing. Now, here's another anecdote from my life. When my kids, they're now in their 30s, when they were in high school, there was an enormous infrastructure to help them consider the next 4 years of their life. Do you want to join the military? Well, there are places to go to and people to talk to about that. Do you want to work? Well, there's job opportunities. You can go online, LinkedIn, blah, blah, blah. You want to go to college? Okay, there's college counselors. You can do college visits. You can explore different colleges, which we did with our kids. What can you afford? Do you want to be in a city? Do you want to be in the country? Do you want to be out of this country? But then when it comes to people's retirement, there's no orientation program. There's no retirement fair where there's 500 different volunteer opportunities that display themselves. By the way, there's a couple of these around the country, but you haven't heard of them, where people can explore, well, who can I be and what can I do and how can I give back? And what if I try it out and it doesn't work? Can I switch to a different kind of volunteer activity, one that feels more right for me? Then we asked, okay, so what's the ideal amount of volunteering? And I had discussion with Mark Friedman years ago when he was coming up with the idea of encore careers, that some people wanted to put a full-time career into doing good. Well, the average retiree says, 3 hours a week would be about right. Now, nobody's going to have their life damaged by spending 3 hours a week helping others. But by the way, 3 hours a week is 4 times the current average retiree volunteer rate. Now, if you look at the growth in our population between 2020 and 2040, this thing that I call an age wave, we're going to have a massive growth in the number of older people, and they will have a massive amount of discretionary time. The United States alone, it's, 2.5 trillion hours of free time that the boomers are going to have. And they're going to have a massive amount of emotional intelligence. and a massive amount, the women and men, of skills and competencies. And so if we as a nation or the world can't dream of good use of and purpose of this desire to be useful, then shame on us. So we added it out at that 3.3 hours a week. That'd be 238 billion hours of contribution of our retirees, and at a very modest assumption of what a person's hourly wage might be, that's a pro bono contribution of just under $7 trillion. So how do we help unleash this longevity bonus? And it will only be a longevity bonus if we make it so. Here's a story. Back in the early 1980s, I've written actually 19 books now, but my 8th book, Age Wave, was mentioned in the kind introduction. And during the early 80s, it took me 9 years to write that book. That was a bear. Came out in 89. And during those years, I was exploring all sorts of phenomena. And this was a picture that I got from a healthcare system that was a client of mine. This is Boswell Hospital in Sun City, Arizona. So when I was around 32, 33, I pulled up to the parking lot of Boswell Hospital because I knew that 85% of their patients were over 65, which most hospitals would claim is a serious problem because Medicare is and Medicare patients present certain kinds of problems that most hospitals are just not geared for. But I pulled my car in the parking lot and a golf cart pulled up and a person drove me to the front door with a canopy so I wouldn't get the heat on me. And then I walked in the front door and I was met by different groups of greeters. And then I thought, wow, that's kind of a nice plus. And then when I sat down to talk about what I wanted to know about the hospital, there were volunteers to help me with that. And then I looked into their wellness programs, and they had 20,000 participants, and they were all run by retired gym teachers and nurses. And they had a radio station. Yeah, you got it. It was run by retired disc jockeys. And what I realized was that Boswell Hospital had over 2,000 volunteers, which was more than any other hospital at that point in the country. And on that lawn, there were 150,000 years of human experience. By the way, I was telling the story in the, mid 80s, maybe late 80s, about Boswell's greeters to the people at Walmart. And that's where their greeter program came from. But what struck me is that here was a community. And by the way, not only Boswell, but the entirety of Sun City, almost all the services are run by volunteers. The police department is called the Posse. It's run by volunteers. The mail is delivered by volunteers. The art centers are run by volunteers. And I realized, wow, these guys have kind of figured something out. So when I wrote Age Wave, my favorite chapter, oddly, when you write a book, I know some of you have written books, you have favorite chapters, but then the world takes over and sometimes doesn't pay any attention to them. My favorite chapter was the last chapter in that book, where I called for the creation of a global elder corps. Strangely, the 5th or 6th chapter in the book was where I talked about marketing to older adults. And that chapter somehow made me into like a legendary figure, put me on the cover of magazines and grew my business, Age Wave. And as was described, I've had a lot of impact on companies and businesses, but I began doing that book with the idea that I was going to create a global elder corps. And by the way, I was told on numerous occasions, that book came out in 89, when Mark Freeman and Linda Fried were cooking up Experience Corps, which launched in 1996. Mark said that his inspiration for Experience Corps, which became Encore, was my chapter in Age Wave. So funny how things twist around. But maybe the time has now come for a global elder corps. With those billion people over 60 around the world, and it will be 2 billion within a couple of decades, that's a huge amount of talent to not take advantage of. But what we need to strengthen our messaging. We need to take this to the level of the White House. We need to take this to the level of the UN. I think the time is up for lots of wonderful programs here, there, this one, that one, this one, that one, It's time that we organize. You know, you do a little bit of reading about Sergeant Shriver when he created the Peace Corps and Kennedy. I mean, they elevated it to a high level. So that takes me back to the what do you see? When you see the growth in the number of older people, does your mind go, as the aging field often turns, to, oh my goodness, we're going to need more people who need more help? Or, my goodness, we have the most extraordinary revolution about to happen. Hundreds of millions of older men and women, and you know how Mark Friedman talks about it, who get to plant seeds who that will grow into trees in whose shade they may never sit. And maybe that's what's missing from our culture. Examples and demonstrations of older people doing things that don't serve them, but that they serve young people, and they serve the young people of the future. So what are the actions needed to close up? And then some questions. I think we've got to reframe the way we think about older adults and their potential to give. And oddly, it's the people who are leading the fields that work with older adults who have the biggest problem in reframing the messages that they've been making. Second, we've got to teach not-for-profit organizations how to do a better job of attracting, retaining, and deploying older adults as high-value volunteers and contributors. There's massive supply demand opportunity here. Next, we've got to tailor the future volunteering so that older adults can give with comfort, with ease, and with dignity. We have to help elders pass their legacy to us and to future generations. And so I think the time is now. I think that the work that you guys do is phenomenal. You know, I was a Gray Panther in the 1970s, and Maggie talked, you know, the subtitle of Gray Panthers was Youth and Age in Action. That still has not happened, that we still have aging organizations that concern themselves with older people. And boy, if there was ever a time coming out of COVID where younger people are gasping for air and are needing help and needing more grown-ups and needing more wisdom and needing more counseling and needing more encouragement, the time is now. So let me turn back to the moderators of this session, and we've got a little bit of time for some questions and answers.
Well, thanks so much, Ken. That was wonderful. I mean, you really made some, shared some very memorable items. The Gillette video obviously resonated with everyone, but also the image of how many hours people are spending watching TV versus volunteering. That was very, very striking. I especially loved it was almost a call to action, your call to action about a global elder corps, you know. And so we have Peace Corps, we have, you know, AmeriCorps seniors. Are you envisioning something along those lines, like a special arm of the Peace Corps, something else as a large enterprise, or is this a call to action for all the nonprofits on the call today and others like it, do something more local? What's your vision for elder corps?
Let me. I'm going to be a little more snarky than I maybe normally am, or a little more upfront. So I launched a project last year called Sages of Aging with American Society on Aging. And I personally, my wife and I funded it. And we interviewed 12 of the most extraordinary pioneers in the field. And we reached out to other organizations in the field and said, you will get these programs for free. All you have to do is do a little promotion, but nobody will be charged. And 37 organizations signed up. And then we watched as the programs ran, and 33 of those 37 did absolutely nothing. Not one social media mention, not one promote, nothing. And I thought, wow, you've got a field where people may say they like to collaborate, but they do not. That people, or maybe they don't feel like they get enough attention or respect. But I think to part of the, you know, Fernando Torres Gil, who many of you know, the former Undersecretary of Aging and dear friend of mine, Fernando says, unfortunately, the field of aging services is a big spaghetti ball of organizations that like their own identity, and they don't necessarily think it better to come together to do something very substantial. I worked with President Clinton he wanted to create an elder corps, and I got President Carter to agree to head it up. And then he was supposed to announce it at at a State of the Union speech, and the week before he got into some misbehavior drama, and he dropped it. And so I think that an elder corps is something that needs to be taken not to the level of an AARP, which does what it does with its acquisitions, but it needs to be at the level of heads of state. So I'm not saying it's a division of the Peace Corps. I would see it being something that a president of the United States or a group of presidents would come together and say, we have a new world, we have new generational connection possibilities, and we're going to create something that the world has never seen. And I think then it behooves all the different individual organizations to take a deep breath and think about, how do we become a part of that versus how do we just put up walls and be ourselves. I think we've got to combine talents and forces. I see, having been friends with Mark and Linda for years, and many of your programs, the struggle to continually raise money, to continually get attention, to continually try to, grow. It's tough, and I think that this is a time to join forces. That's my belief.
Great. Maybe, the UN Council on Aging or something could explore that. So one of the other questions is, are there any resources or sites that you'd recommend? I mean, other than your own, but in addition to your own, for people to be able to stay current with some of the topics that you've discussed today?
Yeah, I would say, and I'm not here to promote AgeWay, but on our site, we've got every study we've done, we make available to the public for free. And we've done ones on caregiving and on contribution, and over this last year or so on how older people are coming out with a desire to be useful. So there's some stats in those that are pretty good armaments. You can use them to empower your work. But I also, I don't know who is taking the lead. I don't know what organization is the one that people can fall in with. So I wish I could say to you, it's that group or it's this group. I'd like to feel that the Encore organization could be the one that takes the lead because I'm so fond of Encore. But I don't know. If there's one thing I've learned, I spent my first 15 years in the not-for-profit sector, in the last 35 years here almost in the for-profit sector. And the for-profit sector understands scalability much better than the not-for-profit sector does. They understand if you've got 27 little companies and nobody's ever heard of your brand, you're not going to get anywhere. So how do you turn them into something that people are talking about and hearing about and telling their mom about and their dad about, and they've got a marketing PR division so that when you turn on 60 Minutes, you learn about it. When you watch your local news, you learn about it. And you pick up a cover of Time magazine and everybody's talking about it. And so I think this idea of getting something that goes to scale and that gets everybody's attention and people feel is the thing that we've been waiting for. I don't have somebody to recommend to you on that. Maybe one of you guys want to do that. I'd sure like to be a part, but I don't see myself. I'm not a good manager of organizations. So I don't see it's something that I would personally do.
No, and you're definitely right. It's a great role for the Encore Network to get behind. Doug, I'm going to turn it to you to see if there's any one last question.
Yeah.
You're muted, Doug.
Yeah, one question that came up is how do we motivate people who seem unclear about their interests, it's easy to make excuses. How do we get beyond the inertia that we seem to see and that your research documents?
All right, so 4 examples come to my mind, and thanks for the question. And I have not pre-thought this, so this is just off the top of my head. So one example is role models. You turn on your TV and, older people are portrayed 7 times more than young people as falling down and can't get up and having diseases and terrible problems. And that's what you see. Now, there are a few shows that are coming on the air, Hacks with Gene Smart, who's in her mid-70s, and Jeff Bridges got a show on the air where he kind of plays a badass mid-70s guy. And you're beginning to see positive or provocative examples of older people, but largely you don't see a lot of older people from the neighborhood doing, other than some, yeah, I watched Lester Holt the other night, and there was a grandma who was a lifeguard in her local pool, and he thought that was just absolutely unbelievable. And I thought it was lovely, but yeah, when we get a million such people, then that's unbelievable. So one thing is role models. The second thing is, I think we've got to make it easier. I think when people are leaving their jobs and leaving their workforce, there ought to be an orientation at the workplace, maybe 5 years in advance to start. There are 100 different ways that you can deploy once you leave here. Here's what they are. Get a taste, get a feel, start dreaming about it. Like everybody else does with everything else, from marriage to dating to TikTok to whatever. We in the aging volunteer world do not do that at the workplace very effectively. Third, it's time we started calling older people out for doing so little. I mean, honestly, we should be ashamed of ourselves. Ashamed of ourselves. 47 hours of television a week. That is shameful in a time when the world really needs our help. And last, I think that we need new leaders. I think that we need, not so much only in Washington, but someone has got to emerge, or some people have got to emerge, and it can't be another AARP thing. They've got the lock on everything. Somebody's got to emerge who had a big idea, big dream with an enormous engine in him or her, who can create something that changed the world. And we got to be on the lookout for that.
Well, with that, Ken, we're going to end. We want to thank you. I want, on behalf of everyone at the Encore Network and everybody who was part of this presentation, thank you, Ken, for this your presentation today. Very inspiring. You could tell there were a lot of people who were in the chat talking about becoming remotivated and thinking about getting re-engaged in what you're talking about in terms of giving back and doing something more purposeful.
And I do want to say one thing. I don't mean to imply that all the good works that you're all doing are not good works. They really are. But the number of older people that we're going to have and their absence of contribution is unnerving. And so now's the time we got to take this thing up to another level.
Oh, for sure.
Way higher level.
Yeah, the need for that hasn't changed. It as you said, it's become even more urgent, and the opportunity has increased. So, and
I want to add one last thing. As I got the list of attendees, and they were 3/4 women. Hey, we dads, we men. I think of Rudy Giuliani with the ink coming down the side of his head as an example of manliness of the modern era, and it's unfortunate. We men need to step up and do more. And in addition to the women who are really taking the lead.
Right, definitely. Well, thank you again. We appreciate everyone joining. Encourage everyone to visit encorenetwork.org for more information, many more events like this. We don't have anything scheduled for August, but we do have events scheduled coming up in September and on. So visit our website. Thank you all again for joining, and we will be sharing the wonderful deck of slides that Ken has shared today, and this event is being recorded. So thank you all, and have a great day.
Be well, everyone.